Greetings, YouTube. Today I'd like to talk about Chronica, which is a setting I picked up off of Drive Through RPG. It's for Pathfinder First Edition, and it intrigued me because it's a high fantasy version of our world in the 17th century. So it's got some of the classic non-human species as well as a couple of new ones. There was an avian one, and then there's a reptile one, which is built along the dinosaur raptor design. Really well done. The illustrations in this book, all the color illustrations are top notch, and all of the pencil type sketches they do in there for like equipment, weapons, and armor and things like that. Absolutely beautiful. I love a sketch style and illustration if it's well executed, and all of the illustrations in this book are bangers. Highly recommended for the art. And I'm looking at this, and it's an alternative history to ours. Obviously, it's high fantasy. And it diverges from our history quite a bit. There is a functioning kingdom in North America, or the Americas known as the Olmec. So they have a large, powerful nation. The Egyptian kingdom never fell as a kingdom. It still remains. Coptic is still the spoken language, but the people that inhabit it are elves. So you have elves speaking Coptic. There are Rakshasa in India who have set themselves up as the true Egyptian gods, which they aren't. They're false gods, but they've convinced their vassals and the slave class that they control in uh, their territories in India that they are the true Egyptian gods and that the people in Egypt are false gods and are worshiping false gods. So it's all a power grab for them, and they very much keep their people in the dark. Very dystopic in many ways. Um, and of course, then we have the indigenous tribes of the East Coast and the rest of the United States, which are not part of the Olmec uh, uh, Empire. We have the standard European kingdoms. We get the British and the Spanish and the French and the Germans. Holy Roman Empire, I should stress, in Germany. Um, and the Russians are big players, and there are monsters out there. They seem to be plaguing the Russians a lot, quite a bit. And there are Russian dwarves. If you want to play a Russian dwarf, it's quite cool. And they have the option of using real world languages as opposed to like the classic fantasy tropes of dwarven, elven, common things like that. And I think that's much more appropriate if you're going to be doing a setting where it's high fantasy in our world. I think you really should be using real world languages to an extent, maybe with the more fantasy languages as older tongues that aren't spoken as often. There's also the Isle of Steel, which is literally a moving isle constructed that is a which is a place where it is almost lawless, where you go because anything that can be bought and sold under the sun can be found in the Isle of Steel. Lots of information, lots of goods and services that you're not going to find anyplace else. And the place keeps moving, so it's hard to nail down. And there's Atlantis, which is very cool. I love a good Atlantis addition to the real world. I've always been fascinated by the legends of Atlantis, even though if you dig down far enough, it always leads you to things like white nationalism. It's kind of depressing that way. Hollow Earth will lead you there too, which is also quite depressing. Um, I'm sorry, I'm fidgeting with something. Uh, so overall, it presented an intriguing world. However, and this is a big however, you will be creating a world that is glorifying the colonization of the Americas, Asia, and Africa. It's already begun. European powers are already in the Americas. They're already in Africa. They're already in Asia. And they're trying to gain more and more power, all the while, of course, vying with each other for political control of both the home territories and whatever they can claim on these new territories. Of course, all these new territories had people living on them, and colonialism is a pretty word for genocide because that's what happens when you decide that you're going to move into a territory, drive out or kill off all the indigenous people and take their stuff. There is no way you can put a sugar coating on this. Colonialism is ugly. And I find myself in a position of being somewhat dumbfounded that in this age, in the 21st century, someone would write a game world that bakes colonialism into it, and you are almost destined to see the colonial territories expand. That's an abomination in my book. Just just that's a horror story. The only way I could run this, if you were to hand this campaign to me and say you have to run this like it is, I would have to run it where the colonial powers in the Americas and in Africa and Asia, though those aren't filled in, this is concentrated in the Americas, we're in the process of being uh, resisted by all of the indigenous peoples on this continent and North, North, Central, and South America, and would eventually be driven off and sent home packing. Um, there's slavery in this setting, of course. And in fact, there's this little blurb, and it's not a very big blurb, saying we understand that slavery is going to make people very, uncomfortable. And if you'd like to just pretend that these people are, are of some kind of, indentured servant, you can, a servitor class. But they weren't. They were slaves. And to put a sugar coating on that, it does a disservice to the real history. But if you say, for example, had the Olmecs and the Atlanteans both kind of giving soft funding to resistant forces who were backing indigenous groups, backing slave revolts, and eventually bit by bit making it more and more expensive for the European powers to maintain their colonies on this continent, you could eventually convince them to leave and eventually moved to the point where in the 17th, in the 18th century, finally get to this 18th century, and at the time span where we were looking at the American Revolution, you could finally see the liberation of the North American continent, or all the Americas, of the European colonies, and just drive them back into Europe, probably leaving things behind like an embassy, uh, trade posts, and things like that, because the indigenous people of this continent are not stupid. They're going to want to be able to trade for things, but they want to have it under their control as opposed to just being exploited and wiped out by European powers. So yeah, I, I I can't imagine how anyone thought this was a good idea, and I apologize to the development team for this. But I read this and I'm like, I just this amazes me. Why would you want to have this setting like this? However, I still think you could do a high fantasy game in our system, our solar system, and you expand it off planet. Now, there's like magical gate in Egypt, which leads to the Phalanx, I believe, if I remember correctly. So maybe you find another gate that leads to Mars and Venus. And Mars is a desert planet. It's the classic Barsoon kind of a desert planet. And you find out that it used to be populated by the Greys. And they had a vast empire span the entire planet. And they beat Z's. They wiped it out. They extended their lives to forever. And they begin to delve deeper and deeper into psychic research until, over time, one by one, the Greys essentially ascended into being pure energy beings of psionic power, and they just went that way. So now there's a planet populated with monsters and maybe abominations that uh, they created with their experiments. Maybe a few sapient races or species that are beginning to become move up the evolutionary ladder or something, but ripe for exploration. And maybe you find like a gray flying saucer, kind of like a spelljammer. So now you've got the ability to bring that into a game. Think how that might turn the tides in a battle if you show up with the heroes show up with a fleet of flying saucers to take on the European powers in North America. That would be entertaining. You could do the jungle world of uh, Venus with nothing but wild animals. There's monsters and abominations. Maybe there's things like, the aboleth or something dwelling deep in the oceans or something. Um, and they've got machinations on the world at large. Maybe they've planted the seed of sentience in certain things. Who knows? And then you've got, say, Neptune's a water world. The point is that there's lots of things you could do in our system in the 17th century that I think could be really cool and a lot of fun that don't involve slavery and colonialism, because colonialism is horrible, and I cannot fathom why anyone would want to bake it into a setting, especially because they weren't couching it in the term that that the colonial powers are the bad guys. It was just kind of accepted that they're here now, so you can play explorers and you can play the frontiersmen and you can play conquistadors. I think I pronounced that word wrong. You can play all these folks spreading Christianity or spreading Islam or things like that, which is also another ugly real world thing that happened. Wiping out indigenous cultures, wiping out indigenous faiths. The European Christians came to the New World and wiped out entire cultures and languages. Just hundreds of languages were utterly eradicated and erased. And in this setting, that's where it's headed. Yes, the Olmecs are going to give some pushback, but they're not over the entire the two North and South American continent. They're only controlling part of it. And the indigenous folks, the rest are not organized. And again, I would have to play it. They become organized. They become a unified confederation or united republic of indigenous people to push the Europeans out and establish their own nation that is going to be more receptive and more accepting of indigenous ways of life, that's not being having things imposed upon them by white Christians, which is what's going on. The white Christians have shown up on the continent, and they're going to impose their worldview onto the indigenous people on this continent. And that is something that happened in the real world. And I don't think it's something that we should be doing in games. I really don't. So if you want to look at the setting, because it does have some cool elements, I do think it does, and the artwork is absolutely stunning. So it might even be just worth it for you if you're into good high fantasy sketches and still illustrations. This book has got you taken care of. But yeah, I was taken aback with how the only way I can put this, and I apologize, the absolute tone deafness of this setting. It just seemed like nobody stepped back and said, hey, maybe we shouldn't be repeating history, because that's what they're doing in this. They're repeating history just in high fantasy with talking lizards and birds and dwarves and elves and things like that. But that doesn't make it right. It wasn't right when it happened in the real world, and it's not right to do it in a high fantasy setting either.